Thanks so much, and welcome everyone. We are lucky to be joined by two fascinating experts to talk about Russia's war in Ukraine. Stephen Biddle of Columbia University and the Council on Foreign Relations, and Melinda Haring of Razom for Ukraine and the Atlantic Council. And what's more, we have really wonderful timing for this webinar today. We have this aid package, $60 billion headed to Ukraine, perhaps unexpectedly passing or perhaps inevitably passing. We'll talk about that. And we're going to talk about the impact of the package in some detail. But I think it would make sense to start today to talk to Melinda and Stephen about what they see going on in Ukraine, what they see on the battlefield. And Steve, I'm hoping you might start with a military perspective of what's going on, and then Melinda, maybe you would react to Steve with the bigger picture. But Steve, what is the current situation? How should we look at this moment the battle lines in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think in military terms, the war is basically stalemated and has been that way for a year. Both sides have long since adapted the kind of a deep, well-prepared, reserve-supported defensive dispositions that historically have been very hard for attackers to break through cleanly and exploit decisively. Since both sides have disposed their forces in this way, the battle lines have pretty much stabilized. As there are in all stalemates, there's movement. The Ukrainians took a little bit of ground, but not very much in their summer counteroffensive. The Russians have been taking ground, but not breaking through since the summer counteroffensive. But in largely stalemated conflicts of this kind, the weight of materiel tends to be what drives where the marginal advances or retreats are going to occur. And because of the delay in U.S. aid, a logjam that appears now to have broken, the Russians have enjoyed a substantial material advantage since the summer and have been using that to grind forward slowly at great cost to them and to the Ukrainians in significant parts of the front, but with very little chance that they're going to break through or cause some Ukrainian collapse, as long as the drought in U.S. aid ends, which it now appears to have done. So, if you were hoping that Russia was going to break through, heaven forbid, the best odds of that by far would have been if Western aid had remained turned off and Ukraine eventually was starved for munitions. It now looks unlikely that that's going to be the case. So I think the best prognosis for the near future is continued stalemate on the ground militarily.
Melinda, tell me how react to Steve and give us the larger picture here.
Sure, glad to be with you all. Thanks so much. So I agree with Steve, but I'm just going to zoom out a bit. So the delay took 8 months too long, and the cost was Ukrainian lives, and we saw villages fall that didn't have to fall. So we saw the city of Avdiivka fall, and there's huge pressure on other villages out in eastern Ukraine as a result. What does this mean, though, Julian? That's what I'm really interested in. It means a big sigh of relief in Ukraine. I was talking to partners and looking online, and the immediate response is thank you. The second response is from a Ukrainian chef who's preparing a celebratory meal when the aid arrives on the battlefield for his soldiers. But there's palpable relief on the front line, and it buys the Ukrainians 6 to 12 months, depending on how quickly they use the munitions. So that's a good thing. It's going to keep the Ukrainians in the fight. I think the other big thing, though, that's changed is the Ukrainians have switched to active defense. So President Zelensky started talking about the need to build defensive fortifications last December, and then they didn't do anything for 2 months. And Kyiv finally started to build those fortifications in February. And you see those fortifications along the front line and around the city of Kyiv as well. This is, in my view, this is one of the big mistakes that was made, is that the West gave Russia way too long to build heavily reinforced defensive fortifications in the second year of the war, and Kyiv didn't respond quickly enough and build those fortifications.
So I think that some people hearing that the United States is about to give $60 billion, and that is still going to lead to a stalemate, or still is only going to have Ukraine being on the defense, would be shaking their heads like, oh, we're trying to put in American money for a victory, not for a stalemate. Is that the wrong way of thinking about it? Is stalemate good enough? Why do you think that 60 billion is not going to allow for a new offensive that will, change the dynamic? Steve, do you want to start and Melinda weigh in?
Yeah, I think $60 billion for stalemate is in many ways the wrong way of thinking about it. And that's because there are common misperceptions about how wars in general end and how this war can end. Right, so there is a view held by some in the United States that what the United States should be doing is enabling Ukraine to win the war militarily, obtain military victory. We should be providing the assistance necessary to bring this about. What that means or comprises or looks like is usually vague, but usually the implicit military victory picture is we enable Ukraine to retake all of its territory, either all of its territory as of February 2022, or from the more ambitious folk, all of its territory as of January 2014. The problem is, if Ukraine could do that, and I think it's unlikely that they could, but if they could, that doesn't end the war. Right? Military victory in any ordinary interpretation of the term means you've achieved your ends, and the war is stopped. But Ukraine has no ability to stop the war simply by retaking all of its territory, because Russia has an incentive to just keep fighting if that happens. I mean, imagine a scenario in which Ukraine has retaken all of its territory, and now Vladimir Putin goes to the Russian people and says, okay, war is over. Sorry, we lost. We gained nothing. And I started a war that killed tens to hundreds of thousands of Russians to absolutely no point. But please don't kill me and topple my government. And all he has to do to avoid that scenario is to say, instead, the war continues. As we observed in 1941 to 1942, we sometimes suffer reverses. We were fighting the entire West, after all. That's only to be expected. But as we did in the Great Patriotic War, we will come back. And so Putin doesn't admit defeat because he doesn't have to. The war continues. Russia continues to engage in strategic bombing against Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities. Russia continues artillery strikes against Ukrainian infantry in the field. The war grinds on. The only way that can be prevented, short of a coup or Putin dying of cancer or some other change of government in Moscow, is if Putin decides that it's in his interest to stop the shooting. Ukraine cannot conceivably destroy Russia's ability to continue the war. Therefore, the only way the war ends is if Putin decides that the war should end, which means that inevitably this war is going to end in some kind of negotiated settlement. Now, that doesn't mean the settlement is a 50-50 partition of the stakes. That doesn't mean the settlement has to favor Russia. But the war will end in some sort of negotiated agreement in which a Russia that could continue to fight if it wanted to chooses not to. Then, so what is the point of spending $61 billion in continued aid? Why don't we just force the Ukrainians to accept a negotiated settlement now, be done with this, and stop all the killing and the dying and the suffering and the destruction? And the problem is you don't get any, all wars end in negotiated settlements. Even World War II did, by the way. All wars end in negotiated settlements, but that doesn't mean you can get one by asking for it because you want one at time T. Right? There can be no settlement right now because A, Russia isn't willing to accept one, and B, Zelensky can't accept one now and stay in government. Right? Something north of 70% of Ukrainians in the latest polling I've seen oppose any territorial concessions to end the war. Therefore, the time is not ripe, which brings you back to the question of what the $61 billion are doing. What fighting does in a war is to create settlement conditions. The fighting changes the two sides' acceptable outcome set and eventually moves the two together, either in the middle or radically to one side, and in a way that eventually creates conditions in which the two sides can agree on terms for stopping the shooting. And it hasn't done that yet in Ukraine. So the purpose of the 61 billion is to enable the fighting to eventually create a tolerable settlement space in which the Ukrainians are not giving away the store, in which Russia isn't getting everything it wants in a way that would create an incentive for Russia to do the same thing again elsewhere in places that might be even worse. Right. So yes, the 61 billion is not the 61 billion is not going to create a breakthrough and immediate Ukrainian recapture of all their ground, but it doesn't have to produce an end to the war on terms that Ukraine and the West would find a lot more congenial than the terms that they could get right now.
Melinda, what do you think the Ukrainian appetite to continue fighting now is? How much more fight do they have left in them? Are they right now, do you agree with Steve that they are not willing to make any territorial concessions, and might that change with time? Tell us a little bit about your perspective on these issues.
Thanks a lot, Julian. I think there's one other caveat that I would put into Stephen's remarks. So there is a possibility, and it's a low percentage play of Russia being defeated in a humiliating way. You know, the war has gone on for such a long time, and Ukraine didn't have the weapon systems, the F-16s, the air defense systems, the long-range rockets that it would have needed to do to get the job done. You know, it is a low percentage play, but that would be the way to get Putin to agree to the settlement table. So Stephen is right. Neither side wants to negotiate. We see this in both sides' remarks from the highest levels. But I'm more interested in society's perspective on this. So when you dig into public opinion polling, 60% of Ukrainians say that they want to fight. It was 70% last year. It's 60% this year. And the war is it's exacting a very heavy toll. Now, I would expect to see those numbers change a bit, Julian, as we see mobilization take root and as we see troops finally get a little bit of rotation and finally get a breather. So Ukraine's troops have been on the front line for more than 2 years. They're exhausted. They want to go home. They miss their families. They haven't had proper rotations. So I would watch that figure. I don't know which way it's going to go, but I suspect it will stay at least 60%, particularly if the guys get some relief on the front lines.
I want to rewind for a minute to last summer's counteroffensive. Ahead of that counteroffensive, Steve, I remember you and I had a conversation, and you were, I would term, cautiously optimistic that the U.S. maneuver warfare training was viable, that Ukraine could learn this on the fly. And you have done some really good work analyzing sort of what went wrong, why the Russian defenses were so strong. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the lessons learned from that counteroffensive have been, and how Ukraine is going to apply those lessons going forward, or how should they?
I mean, I think in general, behavior is a much more important contributor to combat outcomes than many Americans suppose. I mean, Americans tend to be materialists. We tend to think that it's numbers and technology that wins wars. And I think what Ukraine is demonstrating, as 100 years of prior military experience have also shown, is that the way material is used by the two sides is usually more influential for outcomes than the nature of the material itself. So if one were going to have made a case for optimism prior to the Ukrainian summer offensive, it would be that Ukrainian behavior, the proficiency with which they use their material, was going to climb dramatically as a result of systematic retraining by the West, and this would enable greater success. There are two problems with the way that's sorted out. One is they didn't systematically retrain. They got something on the order of 5 weeks of training for brigades that were essentially green as grass before they got the training. The Ukrainians decided to commit their veteran, better trained, more proficient units to defense around Bakhmut and not to the offensive. And they put brand new units into the offensive that had essentially gotten only the most rudimentary training curriculum before they went into combat. I mean, British infantry in World War II got 22 weeks of training before they even went to their units for advanced training before they went into combat. The Ukrainian brigades that fought in the summer offensive got 5 weeks in a more complicated military environment. So that it is possible to systematically retrain armies during a war. This has happened in the past. That's not what Ukraine did prior to the summer offensive. Then there's change on the Russian side, right? So the Russians are not 10 feet tall, but they're not 2 feet tall either. They do learn from experience, they adapt, and they change the way they fight. And their interpretation of lessons from the war's first year was that they needed to deepen their defenses, withhold a larger reserve, prepare those defenses with extensive minefields and barriers, do all the things that historically have produced robust, resilient defenses in previous military experience. That combination of an undertrained Ukrainian military, an adapted Russian defense that finally started doing the things that historically have worked for defenders, and then a set of operational and theater strategic level choices by the Ukrainians that frustrated the devil out of the American advisors they were working with, right? Faced with an extraordinarily difficult challenge and undertrained troops at the tactical level, the Ukrainians nevertheless split their offensive effort over 3 separate axes, and then didn't concentrate effort even within any of the 3 axes in the way the Americans would have preferred. So this combination of behavior that is not historically conducive to great offensive success in a very challenging environment on the Ukrainian side, and behavior on the Russian side that was conducive to robust defense in historical context, created a situation where even larger quantities of Western provided materiel got trumped by the behavioral choices on the 2 sides, producing stalemate. I think the lesson for this experience going forward is that once defenders adopt deep, resilient, reserve-backed, well-prepared defensive positions, it has been extraordinarily hard to break through those kinds of dispositions without massive material superiority in 100 years of observed experience. Both sides are now increasingly disposed that way in Ukraine. It took the Ukrainians a while to make the decision that they were going to have to shift their investment and resources away from offensive preparation and toward defensive preparation, as Melinda was noting, but they have now done it. If they avoid a massive material imbalance as a result of just a cutoff of Western aid, the lesson of the summer offensive going forward, I think, is going to be very difficult for either side to break through cleanly, exploit, and create huge changes in real estate control on the battlefield at this point in the war. A fair amount of that happened in year 1 because behavioral choices had not stabilized, but now they have.
You know, one thing that worked in the counteroffensive was the deep strikes, right? The Storm Shadows striking Crimea, the various drones that were used against the Black Sea Fleet. The Black Sea Fleet was pushed out, a grain corridor kind of opened up. And so those sort of deeper strikes kind of worked. And there's also in the Ukrainian intelligence services certainly a bias toward going behind the lines, perhaps to the discomfort of the Americans. Melinda, how are those kind of attacks playing in the Ukrainian public? How do they is that a morale booster to them? How did they view the overall counteroffensive, both the Crimea part and the kind of push on the southern coast? What's your insight there?
So, Julian, I'm going to put on my political glasses because to me, the biggest lesson from the counteroffensive is that the West put too much pressure on Ukraine to make the counteroffensive happen when the Ukrainians weren't ready. For a lot of the reasons that Stephen just described, they didn't have enough training, they weren't ready to go, and there was a lot of hype and expectation. And I think that we should have given the Ukrainians the time they needed and not put so much pressure on them. So I think that that's one of the mistakes that we made, and hopefully we learn from that in the future of the war. Now, on the Black Sea Fleet, I think that's probably the most underreported story in 23 with the war. It's one of the best good news stories. As you said, the Ukrainians were quite successful in their attacks, and the Russians had to move their ships from far, far away so that the Ukrainians couldn't strike them. One thing that I'm watching in the new package, and I think everyone's watching in the new package that Congress has just approved, it took too long, but it demands that the White House send long-range ATACMS. And I think, as you or Stephen said, these long-range strikes have been to Ukraine's advantage. And what do they do in Ukraine? They buoy people's spirits. Every time Budanov does a special operation or his guys do an operation, all sorts of memes appear on the internet and in Ukrainian social media. And I think it helps people, it helps them to realize why the fight and why the daily bombings and the circumstances they find themselves in are worth it. They see real results. And I think that's part of the campaign. There's a psychological piece to it.
I need to pause to acknowledge that ATACMS is the best acronym in the United States military. But Steve, tell me what you think the impact of these longer range munitions are, and if you were advising the Ukrainian government, how would you use a limited number of ATACMS?
Yeah, I mean, let me start by saying that longer range is a big category that includes some very dissimilar things, right? So longer range in the sense of ATACMS means longer range strike of battlefield targets, mostly logistics and air bases, occasionally command posts, but basically things that are in what would ordinarily be considered the theater of war, and that are related to the ability of the two sides to control territory in the land combat. Then there are deeper strikes against the Russian civilian energy industry, right? And that's a completely different causal mechanism, right? That's coercive strategic bombing. And you can imagine, though, these two different kinds of long-range things having very different effects. As far as the relatively theater scale ATACMS striking of logistics and air bases and command posts and so on, those things have psychological effects, right? That Melinda correctly emphasized. Their military effects are typically very short-lived, right? If you can combine a sudden interdiction strike against a series of logistics and command targets with a ground offensive that can exploit a temporary reduction in logistics throughput, then maybe something could happen, though again, doing that against current Russian defenses is going to be very hard for anybody. That's not the way they've been used in the past. The way that typically what's happened is when the Americans provide the next tranche of longer range, theater scale weaponry, HIMARS, shorter range ATACMS, now longer range ATACMS, they suddenly render vulnerable a collection of Russian targets that had been just beyond the reach of the last generation of Ukrainian ranged weaponry, and they destroy a bunch of stuff, but they don't exploit it on the ground. The Russians adapt and move their logistics a little bit deeper, and they learn how to counter the guidance systems of the missiles, and the effectiveness goes way, way down. When was the last time you heard about a high-profile HIMARS strike in Ukraine? Well, about a year ago, probably, because HIMARS is not militarily decisive anymore. The new longer-range ATACMS aren't going to be decisive for more than a couple of months before the Russians adapt to it, partly by reorganizing their logistics and command infrastructure, and partly by being more aggressive at countering GPS and the particular guidance modalities that the new missiles use. So my guess is that given how Ukraine is likely to be unable to exploit the effects with maneuver on the ground, the military consequences of longer range ATACMS are going to be way down at the margin. And my own preference would be not to provide them, actually, because the assistance is dollar limited, right? The Congress establishes dollar constraints on how much we can give Ukraine. Giving them small numbers of expensive weapons whose effectiveness is quite short-lived is, in my view, not the efficient way to use dollar assistance. And F-16s is the worst imaginable. right? A tiny number of stratospherically expensive weapons whose effect on the battlefield outcome will be trivial. Artillery ammunition is where the need is. Air defense ordnance is where the need, right? There are lots of, in my view, more efficient ways to use the resources than the kinds of highly visible, politically salient, but very expensive, small numbers and easily countered things that people tend to talk so much about. Now, the strategic bombing campaign against the energy industry is a whole nother issue, right? The Americans don't want it done with American equipment because we're afraid of the escalatory potential in this. But it's very similar to the War of the Cities in the Iran-Iraq War, right? Where a basically stalemated land war between Iran and Iraq led to an escalation to counter-value targeting against civilian assets in major urban areas in both Iran and Iraq that eventually had a significant effect in creating coercive leverage among the things that were going on to produce the end of the war. So you've got an analogously stalemated front line on the battlefield in the theater. And sure enough, you've got escalatory behavior. The first such escalation was the Russian initiation of strategic bombing against Kyiv, over a year ago. Now the Ukrainians are taking a similar tack. I mean, the political coercive effects of these respective strategic bombing campaigns is another issue, and arguably likelier to create dynamic changes in the political picture for good or for ill than the ATACMS issue on the battlefield itself within the theater.
So we talked a little bit there about escalation, and obviously the Biden administration has been very focused on escalation. And from time to time in this conflict, the nuclear fears have been raised. Would Vladimir Putin use a nuclear weapon on the battlefield? Would he use a tactical weapon? Would he do some sort of demonstration of force? What do you both think about the likelihood of that? Have those fears been exaggerated? Does Putin lose any leverage his nuclear arsenal gives him once he uses it, and so therefore he won't? Or could one of these could the escalation, if it goes to civilian targets, ultimately lead to some sort of nuclear weapon use? Who wants to start on that? Steve, why don't you?
Melinda does. Melinda, do you want to lead, or?
Sure, I'll jump in. I'm going to politely disagree with Stephen, though, on ATACMS. I talked to, we have 3-star and 4-star generals we talk to pretty regularly, and they're pretty insistent that ATACMS, even though they are expensive, I understand Stephen's point, are significant, in particular for Crimea. The Ukrainians are starting to build long-range rockets, and they'll be able to hit Crimea and then also hit Russia proper. But for now, I would go with what the Ukrainians asked for, and they've been begging for long-range ATACMS for multiple years now. So I take your point, but I think that it's important for the Ukrainians to define the weapon systems that they need. On nukes, if it's a yes/no decision, I don't think it makes sense for him to do it. So the way that the Ukrainian forces are spread along the front line is very thin. Vladimir Putin doesn't gain very much by using a tactical nuclear weapon there, and I think he's the pariah of the world once he does. And there are other actors that he listens to who are telling him not to do it. So I don't see very many incentives for him to do it at this point.
Yeah, I mean, Melinda and I clearly disagree on ATACMS and Crimea, for that matter. Just a brief word on that before getting to the actual question that Julian asked. Yeah, I'm sure they would use them against Crimea, but that doesn't change the battlefield lines radically, right? I mean, Crimea is a logistics base, but one of a variety of logistics bases. Even if ATACMS somehow annihilated the Russian military presence in Crimea, which it won't, the effect will be non-zero, but modest and short in duration before the Russians adapt to it. So I disagree with the 2- and 3-star generals you're talking to, and would be happy to chat with them directly if they would prefer. I also don't think we should necessarily defer to the Ukrainians and what they say they want. I mean, because among the problems here is what we can give them is shaped by American politics, not Ukrainian politics. And I don't think they understand quite thoroughly enough the mechanics by which we can get them the aid, and especially the dollar constraints. Because I think if they were more attentive to the dollar constraints, they would be less enthusiastic about small number, high cost things that just suck up the entire, legislative dollar value. And anyway, moving from ATACMS to nuclear weapons. I certainly agree with Melinda that the odds that Putin would use nuclear weapons are not high, but they're not zero. Right. So the whole problem with the nuclear issue in Ukraine since the war started has been, like most nuclear strategy and policy questions, you're dealing with small probabilities of catastrophic events. And it's all about balancing risk. Right. So during the Cold War, the nuclear strategy debate was about balancing the risk of accidental use against failing to deter a Soviet attack on West Germany. And we spent a huge amount of time and effort taking a small risk of a Soviet nuclear attack on the United States and making it into a smaller risk, because the consequences, if it happened, would be so grave. The situation in Ukraine now is similarly, I don't think there's a 50% chance that Putin is going to use nuclear weapons, but there's a non-zero chance. And when you're involved in a war with a power that has in excess of 5,500 nuclear warheads, and where a mistake by them or by us or by both that leads to nuclear release and some sort of hard to predict escalatory process after that could literally end Homo sapiens if you screw it up, this focuses the mind. And I think it's responsible statesmanship for the Biden administration to be concerned about this. Now, the problem is you've got risks to balance here, like in all nuclear policy challenges, right? So if you act to minimize the risk of Russian nuclear escalation in Ukraine, you maximize the risk of Russian conventional aggressive success in a way that leads to more aggression and just kicks this whole problem down the road with even higher stakes next time. That's not great. But if you pay no attention to it at all, you run the risk that this low probability event happens and a catastrophe of historic magnitude occurs that's obviously bad for Americans, bad for Russia, and bad for Ukrainians, and bad for everyone on the planet. Right? So the Biden administration's instinct, I think, faced with this problem of low but non-zero risk of escalation and challenges and risks that need to be balanced, has been gradualism. Right? Their view, I think, has been changing things suddenly creates a higher risk of escalation. Changing things slowly creates a lower risk of escalation. For what it's worth, that's pretty consistent with what cognitive psychologists tell us about human risk behavior. Right? The general view of cognitive psychologists is that people tend to be more risk acceptant in averting loss than in seeking gain. And the greater the loss you're averting, the more risk acceptant people get. And in the context of Ukraine, if suddenly you were somehow to create, I don't think this is likely at this point in the war, but if somehow you were to create a collapse of the Russian military and an immediate coup threat in Moscow, right, that's the kind of scenario that creates a relatively higher risk that to avert a massive personal loss of office and life on the part of Vladimir Putin, that he takes the huge gamble of nuclear escalation. And therefore, the Biden administration's instinct has been to escalate, but slowly. Right? There's an argument you hear in this debate that Russia hasn't escalated and therefore they won't escalate. And that's just wrong on the facts. Russia has escalated repeatedly. They escalated when they invaded the country in February 22. They escalated when they mobilized an additional 300,000. They escalated when they started a strategic bombing attack. They escalated when they annexed 4 oblasts, right? So both sides have been escalating, but slowly and gradually. And I think the Biden view is that that is a responsible reaction to the need to balance risks. Obviously, critics of the Biden administration don't buy it. But I think given the scale of the catastrophe, if the low probability event happens, some degree of concern with it is appropriate. And therefore, I'm generally less critical of the Biden administration's gradualism on this score than many people have been, even cognizant as one needs to be of the cost of behaving that way.
So it is now time to open it up to audience questions. I want to invite Haley back to the virtual stage here to choose some of the best ones, and a reminder out there to upvote the questions you like in the Q&A.
Thanks, Julian. Hello again, everyone. My name is Hallie Posner. I'm the Assistant Director of Programs here at the Bulletin. As Julian mentioned, if you have a question for our speakers or moderator, please put it in the Q&A so we can all see them. And if you see a question that you like in the Q&A function, please remember to upvote and click on that thumbs up little image under the question that you like. And please know that we see all questions in the Q&A function. Some may just be further up in the queue than yours if we're unable to get to everyone today. And then as a quick reminder, a recording of this program will be available on our website in the coming days. Now let's go on to our first question. Similarly, taking the thread from the discussion, Kenneth Benedict asks, might Putin's nuclear threats be more explicit in the future if Russia looks like it's losing ground in the war? And how do these threats constrain NATO actions?
Melinda, what are your thoughts on that and Putin's explicit kind of nuclear saber rattling?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think it's important to look at the work that ISW has done. They've tracked Vladimir Putin's about 24 nuclear threats, and he doesn't just wake up, have his Wheaties and, start issuing threats. There's a pattern there. He issues nuclear threats when he's not doing so well. So I take Stephen's caution seriously. A statesman like President Biden does have to weigh these risks, but it's a pretty clear pattern of intimidation that Putin is using nuclear weapons because he knows it scares the West from either giving additional systems or making decisions that are hard or uncomfortable. So I would caution us to see his nuclear threats in a bigger context. Julian, I did a bad job answering your direct question earlier on how long the Ukrainians can fight. So I asked Timofey Milovanov, who's the president of the Kyiv School of Economics, that question. And he said 12.5% of Ukrainians of the workforce are fighting now, and you can go another 12.5%. So I wanted to give you a precise number.
Great. Haley, we'll take the next question.
Excellent. Next, we have Stephen Black. He asks, is there no prospect of bleeding Russia in a beneficial way, both to dissuade future encroachments against NATO and other countries, as well as helping establish the principle that you can't change international borders without some heavy penalty? And this question is in terms to aid money.
So, Steve, I want you to answer that, but I also want you to address a question that I didn't get to, which is, how real is the threat that Putin goes on to the Baltic states or Poland after that? This is something that U.S. politicians say all the time. This is something Eastern Europe believes, but is that really Russian ambition?
I think it's a serious threat, but again, all these things are probabilistic, right? There's no guarantee that Putin would go invade Estonia if Ukraine comes out this way as opposed to that way. This is all about balancing risks. So the usual counter argument is to say this war has been a military catastrophe for Russia. It's wrecked the Russian military. It's imposed huge cost. Surely Putin would, if he got out of this with his skin intact, would say, "Ooh, boy, got lucky there. I'm not going to try that again." But you could have made the same argument about Russia after Chechnya, right? So the Second Chechen War is this long, grinding, expensive, destructive conflict that Russia eventually manages to terminate on acceptable grounds. And you could look at that and say a rational Vladimir Putin will respond to that bloodletting and say, not going to do that again. And yet you got Crimea, and yet you got Georgia, and yet you got Syria, right? The empirical record of the way Putin has responded to these problems has been, he's been willing to conduct further military adventures after licking his wounds, putting things back together and getting ready for the next one, and has done this 4 times in a row, including some really expensive exercises. So, I mean, if you add number 5 to the list, right, if the Ukraine war, like the Chechnya war, eventually ends on grounds that Putin considers to be, in his calculus, tolerable, why would we think that after 4 of these in a row, after the 5th in a row, that would be the end of it? I mean, if I owned real estate in Estonia, right, I would sell. If this war comes out well for Putin and badly for Ukraine, not because I think there's some guarantee that Russia will just march into the Baltics right after this. A, they'll take time to lick their wounds, as they have after these other wars. B, this is all probabilistic. C, Putin may get a heart attack and die next week. Who knows? But again, when you engage in the balancing of probability and risk that is the heart of international security policy statespersonship, I think there is enough reason for concern here to care quite a bit about how the Ukraine war comes out, above and beyond the normative issues of standing in defense of a people that were invaded by a hostile neighbor at no fault of their own. I think there are hard security stakes for the US and for the West if Putin comes out of this with the ability to interpret the thing as having been a win. I think it leads to a high likelihood of number 6.
So having driven down real estate prices in Estonia, we'll turn to Haley to throw another question out.
Absolutely. Our next question comes from Paul Ellison. Which other countries are providing military support to Ukraine that is significant in comparison to the value provided by the US previously and now under new legislation?
Melinda, will you handle that? And in addition to the sort of military support question, will you also talk a little bit about what other kinds of aid Europe is providing from your knowledge?
Sure. So there's 3 different buckets of assistance. There's the military assistance that we've been discussing. There's something super unsexy but super important called budget support. And then there's typical humanitarian support. So governments have done a package of these 3 things. The second one is really, really important, even though it doesn't get enough play in my view, Julian. The budget support is what keeps Ukraine as a state alive. So it pays pensions, it pays for the railways, it keeps hospitals working, and it pays the salaries for these folks. So Ukraine is not a failed state after 2 years of war, in part because of this budget support. And the European Union in particular has been very strong on budget support. As you might suspect, Congress is wary about it and doesn't like it very much. So, if there is an additional package of assistance, I would expect it to be very heavily focused on military assistance. Okay, so who are the big boys when it comes to military assistance? It's the United States, obviously, on military assistance. Poland is huge. And percentage-wise, the Baltic states are also huge. France talks a big game, but they actually don't deliver very much, which is kind of surprising after Macron's big statement about strategic ambiguity. And their excuse is we gave Scout missiles. The other sort of laggards are Portugal, Italy, Spain. They're not doing very well. And it sort of depends on when you take a picture. Some people were great at the beginning and are not good now. The Slovaks were good at the beginning and they've had a change of government, not so good now. One other little tiny point, if you don't mind. I agree with if I would had real estate in Estonia, I would sell. 2 other obvious points that Stephen didn't make are I take Vladimir Putin at his word, especially after the invasion of Ukraine. He wrote this long, ridiculous essay about how Ukrainians don't exist and there is no such thing as a Ukrainian identity. So if Vladimir Putin is saying that he's going to go after the Baltics or Poland next, I think that when you're assessing risk, that should definitely go on the list. The other piece, though, is also Trump and what he could do to our international system. So if he is elected and he finds ways to undermine NATO and Putin has had success in Ukraine, he's going to see that as a green light. There's no consequences. As Stephen, I think that's what Putin makes of recent history, as Stephen said very well, in Chechnya and Georgia and so on.
So if I want to make the case for investing in Estonia, I'm going to say that the one thing that this Ukraine war, the war in Ukraine has proven is that Article 5 works, right? At the beginning, we were thinking, oh, we're going to have a lot of sabotage in Poland, or we're going to see strikes on the supply depots. Putin has not done that. Putin has not touched NATO territory. The Article 5 is strong in Putin's mind. React to that both. What do you think? Steve, you start, then Melinda, you react on the NATO, the strength of NATO question.
Yeah, let me start by saying, lest I get a bunch of emails from Estonian realtors, I said, if Putin succeeds, then yeah. So those of you with real estate in Tallinn, you can stay there, says Professor Biddle, for the time being, certainly. So relax, realty industry in Estonia, at least for now. So with respect to NATO, there's a lot of deterrence and a lot of escalation going on in this war, right? Putin has been deterred from doing a variety of things that would be militarily advantageous. The aid flow comes in through a relatively small number of lines of communication, through Poland. Those have not been attacked. We have been deterred from doing things, right? So there's a lot of deterrence going on, and there's a lot of gradual escalation going on. So the idea that Russia just has maximized its use of violence is not true. Deterrence actually works within limits and bounds. Now, a lot of this debate also turns on these issues of war termination that you raised earlier, Julian. So if the war, like all wars, must end in a settlement of some kind with some partition of the state, how do you get Ukrainians to be willing to accept any settlement at all, given that any settlement will leave a Russia on their border that has demonstrated the willingness to invade them, and almost certainly is going to require security guarantees of some kind or another to persuade Ukrainians that this won't just repeat itself in a few months or a few years after Russia has licked its wounds. Those security guarantees might come from NATO, they might come from the EU, they might come from some coalition of the willing, who knows. They might involve, paper guarantees. I suspect they will probably involve troops on the ground. If they involve NATO, on the other hand, you've got all the political complexities of a very large organization with members that vary significantly in their perceived political interests being required to all agree to extend a NATO security guarantee into Ukraine. My suspicion is that the political heterogeneity of the NATO alliance will make that very difficult to bring about. So, but I suspect that you will get some kind of security guarantee as part of whatever package that eventually ends this war that will probably be a la carte, right? That individual states acting bilaterally, or some coalition, some contact group that isn't the formal NATO alliance and probably isn't the European Union constructing itself in a way that would give Ukrainians the confidence that they could accept a deal that without just it being a temporary ceasefire.
We're going to take one more audience question, but Melinda, do you have a NATO thought before we did that?
I think the only response that I would have is we already have a la carte security guarantees, and that's not going to fly for the Ukrainians. And NATO is saying it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. I think in order, Steve is exactly right. The only way that Ukrainians are going to agree to some kind of negotiation and hypothetically give something up is going to be with NATO security guarantees. I don't think they're going to buy these state to state guarantees that there's nothing binding about them. And Julian, you know this from kicking around in Kyiv. It takes 2 minutes for a Ukrainian to bring up 1994 in the Budapest whole memorandum and how unhappy they are with it. This is the deep problem, the lack of real security in Ukraine, and it will continue to persist until we satisfy them with a binding guarantee.
I think that's a very good point. That hangs over any negotiation or any promises. Haley, give us our last audience question.
Sure. So our last one, a couple of folks have asked a similar question, which is, many people in the US and Europe think that a Trump victory in November will lead to a Russian victory. Will a Trump defeat lead to a Russian collapse, similar to previous lines of conversation?
Trump and the Ukraine war, the war in Ukraine. Melinda, you start. Steve, you then react.
Okay, so I take a second Trump presidency very seriously. When I go to Kyiv, Julian, the optimists say, don't worry, Trump actually wasn't so bad. He gave us javelins. And I have to point out, the only reason that Trump gave them javelins is because Obama wouldn't, and that he has no sympathy. And the team surrounding Trump this time is not going to be a friendly one. So if Trump is elected, I do not expect much more military assistance. It took a miracle. And we could have an entire conversation about what it took to get this aid package passed over the last 8 months. So and then on the second one, if we see Biden, will Russia collapse? I'm going to be the last person on earth to predict the collapse of Russia. It pays to be pessimistic on Russia. No, I think we're going to continue to see much of the same. If President Biden is elected, that's a much better outcome, though. I am hoping that President Biden in his second term will be even more energetic and more supportive of Ukraine and find a way to make the NATO membership happen. That's my big hope.
Steve?
Yeah, certainly there will be no negotiating progress in the war until the American elections are done, meaning it's clear who's actually going to be in the White House. That may not be November. Right? So I mean, Putin is not going to accept anything less than the whole loaf, as long as there's some prospect that a Trump restoration will work to his benefit. If there is a Trump restoration, I think, like Melinda, my view is this radically shifts the bargaining space in Russia's direction, right? What fighting does in war is it shifts bargaining space, right? And a Trump restoration, I agree with Melinda, is very unlikely to produce meaningful aid for Russia, meaningful aid for Ukraine. And Russia understands that that's going to significantly strengthen its bargaining position. And that's just bad news for Ukraine all around. If Biden is reelected, that doesn't end the war immediately either. In part, it depends on what happens in the Congress. As we've noted, right, a Republican control of the House is capable of delaying U.S. aid for Ukraine dramatically. That would be the case even if Biden is reelected. But if Biden is reelected, the chance for a negotiated settlement that is tolerable for Ukraine and tolerable for the West is much better.
So we're nearing the end, and it's time for a couple closing thoughts. The question I didn't get to that I had hoped to was a little bit about the pace of innovation on this battlefield, and how much both the Ukrainians and the Russians are changing how they use sort of typical things. It seems like warfare is evolving faster than it did in the previous decade, although maybe I'm wrong. But let's close it out. Steve, offer us a couple final thoughts, and then Melinda will give you the last word.
Well, I think the main message I would want viewers to take away from this is that this war, like all wars, is going to end in a settlement, and therefore what everybody's behavior is about in the meantime is over what the bargaining space looks like, in whose favor does it move, and who's right. So the right way to think about all of this is, how will U.S. policy, Western policy, Ukrainian behavior shift where the settlement is going to end up? And the wrong way to think about it is, if only we get the Wunderwaffen that is next on the want list, but we haven't gotten yet, then there will be military victory. Ukraine will win. There will be a ticker tape parade and everything. That's just not the way that's not the way any war ends. It's not the way this war is going to end. A huge fraction of the US debate takes place with that misunderstanding of the process. And therefore you end up with simultaneously greater enthusiasm for things that are bad ideas, in my view, stuff like the F-16, and lower enthusiasm for stuff that's important and could actually make a difference, like $61 billion in ammunition. Right. So I think a better understanding of how wars end, and this war will end, can improve the nature of the policy we engage in, and ideally make the debate over those things more productive.
Melinda, your thoughts?
Julian, I think Stephen made a really interesting point about halfway through, and it's not one that we make enough. Both sides are learning, especially in Washington, especially among the more muscular, hawkish crowd. We like to pretend that the Russians aren't learning, but they are. Both sides are tweaking their systems and responding to each other. And I think it's an obvious point, but the Russians are not idiots, and we need to be honest about that. You asked about technology and innovation that I've seen. So let me give you a specific example. Last October, I went out to Zaporizhia, and I found fashion designers who are not making beautiful dresses and suits. They are making basically ponchos that disguise your body temperature for snipers. So this is the kind of innovation I know you've seen as a reporter over and over again, that people used to do, normal professions, but they found a way to recalibrate and help the war effort. We see this on the drone side as well. Everyone makes drones in Ukraine now, and there's a lot of experimentation. I think we're also going to look back and say that the tank is not so useful. Another thing that we've learned from this war, it doesn't make sense to send extremely expensive weapons if a very cheap drone can obliterate it, right? I think that's going to be another big calculation. My final thought is that Putin is playing for time, and we need to be aware of that, and we need to be aware of the stakes, and we have to get this right. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. I really think this has been an important discussion because I think we hit on some of the things that Washington and the larger debate in America are ignoring about how this war really will end, what the Ukrainians want, what the Ukrainian view is, and how quickly things are changing, and a lot of the slogans around miracle weapons. I thought Steve's point that they all have a half-life, right? That they have a big impact for a little while, but we have to realize that both sides are going to adjust, but we also should know, to Melinda's point, that they're going to be using them in innovative ways that the United States didn't imagine. From 2014 on, the Ukrainians have proven they can use old weapons in new ways with surprising effects. Now, is that enough? Probably not. But this has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope you all will continue to follow Steve and Melinda's work, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you. I will just echo Julian's thanks. Thank you to Stephen Biddle and Melinda Haring for this really interesting conversation, and to Julian for shepherding us through it. And last but not least, thank you to all of you for supporting the Bulletin and participating with us for the last hour. We are adjourned.